This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast, session number 2.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everybody, it's Matt Sikoria. Today I'm really excited to share this conversation I had with Steve Lawyer. Steve is a good friend of mine, and we met way back in the day as first-year graduate students at Auburn University. These days, Steve is the Director of Clinical Training at Idaho State University. In today's episode, we talk a lot about science and pseudoscience. We talk about it in the context of our broader popular culture, but we also get into its implications for clinical practice. So before we get to the interview itself, I want to let you know that this podcast is sponsored by bside21.org. bside21.org is an ABA news site with hundreds of articles connecting behavior analysis to our world in a non-academic format. It's a really great site, and there's all sorts of interesting articles on there. And as I like to tell people, it's kind of like Yahoo News for behavior analysis, but with the added benefit of being factually correct. So when you get a chance, check them out at bsci21.org. That's bsci21.org. The next thing I want to mention before we get to the interview itself is I want to talk about how you can make sure that you can access future episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast. There are basically a couple of ways to get this done. The easiest way to do this is for those of you who are listening to this, who have downloaded it from iTunes and listening to it either on your iTunes application or on your podcast player, is to just hit the subscribe button. That way, anytime I publish a new episode, it'll get automatically downloaded, and that would work the same way for those who have the Stitcher Radio app, for those with Droid devices. Another way to go about this is to listen directly on the website. By the time this podcast is published, I should be able to have a little player button for each episode, and you can just listen to it directly from the website. In order to be notified of new episodes, the easiest way to go about doing that is to, from the website, sign up for our email list. Finally, you can follow us on social media. We are at facebook.com/behavioral observations. And I am also on Twitter, and the Twitter handle is @behaviorpodcast. So without any further ado, enjoy this interview with Steve Lawyer. Steve Lawyer, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing great, Matt.
Thanks for joining me today. We're going to talk about general issues related to science and how we can be better consumers of science, and maybe veer into some things having to do with a preferred topic of yours, pseudoscience. But before we get into that, I know you're a comic book fan, so tell us what your origin story is. I know you grew up in the bastion of behavior analysis in Michigan. So give us a little peek behind the curtain.
Well, I went to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan for my undergraduate degree. And to be honest, I kind of fell into the program there. I went to school there and by relative happenstance fell into psychology. Decided that it was a really interesting way to go for me, primarily with the idea being that we could apply science to human behavior and use that understanding to better humanity and make life better for a lot of folks in a way that we could feel really confident about. And got my undergraduate degree at Western Michigan, very much behaviorally oriented undergraduate program. And so that really forms in many ways a pretty significant foundation for how I view human problems and how I view the world in many ways. I did after I graduated from WMU, I did my graduate work at Auburn University, where I was in the doctoral program of clinical psychology there, which was much more oriented toward cognitive behavior therapy and empirically supported treatments and using an empirical approach to doing mental health care. And Did a postdoctoral fellowship at National Crime Victims Research and Treatment Center. We did a lot of research and therapy on folks who have been traumatized in the community, and with my efforts there being to really do my best to help humanity by applying empirically supported approaches and evidence-based approaches um, uh, to traumatize folks, kids and adults, and ended up working now. I'm a professor of psychology at Idaho State University, where I train clinicians and researchers and doing many of the things that I always wanted to do and I'm lucky enough to do right now.
Wow, that's a pretty concise rundown of your career so far. Now I know, and of course you and I have go back many years. So in our conversations in the past, you've always said something to the effect of you feel that you're a scientist first, a psychologist second, and a behavior analyst third. Do you want to kind of describe what that means in a little bit more detail?
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. So, in my opinion, a scientific worldview is just an amazing worldview, amazing way to view the world and understand how things operate. And so I try to be, to the extent that I can, scientific in how I do things and how I view the world around me. And that involves embracing a whole bunch of different perspectives that are not necessarily tied to mental health or psychology or behavior analysis, but having an appreciation for all things science and understanding how science really has helped humanity, and as just an underlying motivation in most of the things that I do professionally. I put psychology as the second tier of that because from my view, I should maybe make the argument not just psychology, but scientific psychology is what guides what I do by and large as a clinical psychologist. When you think about science, when you think about scientific psychology, there's a whole range of different ways to view the world. I think that give us a nice comprehensive picture of things, and that is not necessarily tied to any one particular school of thought. So I try to be open-minded about how I view the world. I certainly come from a behavioral background, and in my heart of hearts, I'm probably a behavior analyst. But I also try to have an appreciation for other empirical aspects of the field of psychology, and so that's why I put being a psychologist as on the second tier. And then the third tier is behavior analysis, in the sense of that's typically how I view things, but I'm also trying to be open to the possibility that a behavior analytic worldview, as amazing and great as it may seem, doesn't necessarily have the market cornered on the truth. And although by and large that's how I view things, and I think it's in many ways more right than other perspectives, I try to be open-minded, and so it falls underneath the psychology domain, but it's still very near and dear and incredibly important to how I operate day to day as a psychologist.
Okay, I'm looking at your bookshelf behind you, and I think those are. Is that the behavior analyst down the bottom left corner? Did I spot that correctly?
There is the behavior analyst.
Okay, all right.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. And then there's a Freud action figure. Is that what I see as well?
I have a.
See, this is great radio, folks. If you're in the car, you have no idea what you're missing out on.
I have a Sigmund Freud action figure. I have Charles Darwin action figure, obsessive compulsive disorder action figure, and Albert Einstein action figure, and then on the pseudoscience domain, you actually can probably see.
Oh yeah.
You're looking right at my pseudoscience shelf. I actually have a whole collection of pseudoscience paraphernalia, and one of my favorites is a board game called Kreskin's ESP that is replete with all kinds of all manner of things pseudoscience, and so it's good stuff.
So for the listeners out there, you just got the 50-cent tour of the director of clinical training's office at Idaho. So anywho, more seriously, we throw around the term evidence-based quite a bit, and I travel less in the world of academic psychology and more in the world of special education, and to a lesser extent regular education. And so, we want to be concerned with and employ practices that are quote unquote evidence based. And again, that's a big thing in public education circles. Can you talk about what that means, at least from your perspective as someone who is interested in scientific processes in general? What would be a good working definition for someone who doesn't have the kind of research background that that you have?
Sure. Well, I'll give you a little bit of a two-pronged answer here. So in general, in clinical psychology, just like in medicine, evidence-based has a relatively specific definition, but it's a sort of rests on a three-legged stool, evidence-based practice. One is, are you using procedures and techniques and treatment approaches that have empirical justification in the literature? In other words, are you doing things that have been studied, things that have been validated, using approaches that has the confidence of empiricism behind it in some way, shape, or form? And I want to follow up on what I mean by that a little bit more. But the other two legs of the stool are evidence-based practice also really does include your experience as a clinician and your clinical judgments that play in. If you've been working with a population for 10 years, you've amassed at least theoretically a database of information in terms of what sorts of things work with the population that you've worked with. What sorts of skills are you able to muster to bring change into effect? And that can play into the decisions that we make as clinicians. And it is an important aspect of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based clinical practice. Then the third leg is really the client values and characteristics that might help you determine what kind of treatment or what kind of approach you're going to use with an individual. And the thing that's important here is that you can have somebody who presents with a particular problem, and you could have a treatment that based on an enormous literature, you have a treatment that works very, very well with this kind of presenting complaint. But if for whatever reason, whether it has to do with that person's values or their comfort with that particular treatment, if they're not going to do the treatment's not going to work. And so as a clinician, you have to consider what the person's values are with the characteristics that they have to determine whether or not you're going to use a particular type of treatment. So that's really the three-legged stool of what we consider evidence-based practice. But I want to say a little bit more about what I mean by evidence-based, and because I think that term can be problematic for those of us who are interested in empirically based approaches to intervention. Evidence-based typically means using intervention procedures that the therapist uses because there's evidence beyond his or her own clinical judgment that gives the person confidence in the intervention's efficacy or effectiveness. The basic notion here is that people who are providing mental health care should use clinically relevant evidence when providing behavioral health to their clients. But the problem with this is that what counts as evidence can vary across clinicians. So what counts as evidence for me might be different for what counts as evidence for you. But typically for folks who promote evidence-based practice, there is a level of grading in terms of the types of evidence that is better and the types of evidence that's less appropriate to use. So, for example, in clinical psychology, evidence that is amassed using randomized control trials or using group designs where you have an intervention and a comparison to either no treatment or maybe a standard treatment or some other type of treatment are viewed as superior to those that tend to be lower in terms of rigor. So where the bottom rung of evidence would be the case study, which is basically a description of using a treatment for a particular case.
And reporting the outcomes.
But really not having a lot of experimental control over whether or not the treatment that you used was in fact responsible for the outcomes. And the process is relatively straightforward if you talk about common problems that are well researched, such as anxiety or depression and things like that. But this issue becomes a little bit more difficult when you have more esoteric or less common types of presenting complaints where there's not a very strong research base. So the kinds of evidence that people use when they're doing evidence-based practice can really depend on the complaint that's in front of them and the evidence that's available to them.
So if you're working with someone who, for instance, has a low incidence disability, you just can't pull up appropriate literature with ease, or the literature base is sparse, then the level of evidence is going to be less for that particular case. Is that kind of what you're saying?
And that is what I'm saying. So in terms of having a very clear, okay, here's the problem you have and here's the treatment that you use, in that situation, you're much more inclined to rely on, you should still be using an evidence base on relying on what sorts of maybe behavioral mechanisms might be at work with someone with a particular presenting complaint. You still might be in a theoretical domain, but if those are well-established mechanisms, putting those to use when they have a strong evidence base would be another level of using evidence-based treatment.
So I know this is kind of a basic question, but the way in which we talk about what is evidence-based, what is quote unquote backed by science, et cetera. We use those things a lot, especially in the world of autism treatment, when we talk about applied behavior analysis being more or less the gold standard for intervention choices and things like that. And I sometimes hear people say, well, such and such is proven to be effective and such is not, isn't proven, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. Can you comment on the word? I've always been uncomfortable with the word prove. Can you talk about that for a minute?
Sure. Oh yeah. So yeah, the idea that science proves something is true or proves something is not true is a very seductive way of thinking about things, but it's really not how science works. Science doesn't actually prove anything, at least the way that I view it. And that way of thinking, really, humans we like to think in all or none dichotomies, and there's a level of certainty. And you say, well, science proves this or science proves that. It gives you a level of certainty that's very, very attractive in a variety of ways. But science really doesn't work that way. Things aren't proven per se. The only thing science does is provide evidence for or against a particular perspective. But if you're being a rigorous and good scientist, every piece of evidence is provisional. And so what I mean by that is if I come up with some empirical evidence to support a particular claim, that might give me some confidence that that claim is true, but that evidence is always provisional in the sense that I could gather other evidence in a different context or in a different way and ultimately come to the conclusion that that original finding that I came up with was problematic in a variety of ways, whether it was spurious, it just happened by chance, or it could be that there were some other factors that were playing in that I didn't control for. And so the conclusions that we draw in science are always provisional, and we're never really proving anything. But what we are doing is trying to shade the areas of probability. I actually use a term that Richard Dawkins uses when he talks about science, and especially when we're talking about science and talking about the unprovable sorts of things like religious beliefs and what have you. But I think it applies here too. We don't prove that one thing is true or exists or what have you, but we do shade the areas of probability where we say, yeah, we have more or less confidence in this based on the evidence. And the more evidence you have, the more confident you can feel in that conclusion. But you should never really, I think as a scientist, should never get too comfortable with the idea that you've proven something one way or the other, because we could always be wrong in some way.
So put it a different way, are you with each piece of evidence, or let's say with each additional study in a vein of research, you're at least reducing the likelihood of that theory being false.
Exactly. So let me use. I'm not a biologist. I'm not an evolutionary biologist, but evolution is a really great example. There is no one evolutionary theory. There's a whole range of evolution related theories. And one of the things that you said that people tend to do if there's a particular scientific theory that they don't like is they'll find one piece of evidence that they think disproves that particular theory. And the reason why that's problematic is they may have found one evidence that is contrary to what that theory says, but they fail to account for the thousands of other pieces of evidence that are very much consistent with that. And so whenever, the rule in science is that you have conflicting evidence. What you have to do is consider which piece of evidence is stronger and which one has the most rigor, where the most rigor has the most value. And so, yeah, absolutely. The more research, the more studies you do on a particular subject matter, the more things point in the exact same direction, the more confidence you have in that. But you always have to be open to the idea that you just missed something, that everyone has missed something. And ultimately that proves to be wrong. And that's progress. That's how science works, is by figuring out what we're doing right, but also figuring out what we're doing wrong.
Well, that's probably a good segue to talking about being consumers of science. As you and I were talking offline, many behavior analysts have training in single subject or within subjects designs with regard to evaluating research and things like that. And it's possible that many of us who are have backgrounds in psychology and general psychology and experimental psychology have had exposure to between subjects or experimental designs or what have you. But I'm thinking that there are probably others who haven't had that exposure. So how can we be good consumers of science? Because there's always these things you see in popular media, such and such study, and had this, control and experimental group and blah, 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 blah. And, as a behavior analyst, we're used to consuming things, research in terms of, baseline, phase changes, reversals, et cetera. So to the kind of less trained eye, if you will, can you help us out here? What are some things that we should look for, and what are some red flags? What when things might get a little fishy, if you will.
Yeah, sure. No, I think it's a great question, and I would so for behavior analysts, hopefully, and this is where again I come back to this idea of I'm a scientist before I'm a psychologist, and a psychologist before I'm a behavior analyst. And I would hope that behavior analysts are scientists first and foremost. And what that would mean is that they're consuming evidence, that they're consuming information that comes from outside their field. You have to keep in mind that one of the great aspects of science is its self-correcting machinery, that if you're doing something wrong, it might be hard for you to notice that you're doing something wrong, and it's a lot easier for someone else to do something wrong. And if you have pieces of evidence that are conflicting from outside the field, that's important to know about. It's not always comfortable to know about, but it's important to know about because it can help give you an insight into thinking how you could be doing things different. So what I would suggest is that behavior analysts, I would recommend, if they don't have an understanding of between groups designs and randomized control trials, maybe to learn a little bit more, not to add more to their lives, but rather to make them better consumers of scientific research. The reality is, for better or worse, the vast majority of scientific research out there is done using designs other than single case designs.
Yeah, definitely. And, one of the things I saw Greg Hanley talk about at a talk years ago is that, the kind of groundbreaking Lovaas study of that was a group's design, and that was one of the ways in which that got attention, because people were able to consume it, if you will, who weren't used to looking at data presented or data collected in a within subjects or single subject format.
Yeah, absolutely. I've heard several behavior analysts talk about how important it is to reach across the aisle, if you will, to to journals and use procedures that are attractive to other approaches. The bottom line is behavior analysts, in many ways, do have the market cornered on how to approach certain types of problems. What gets in the way is not their ability to effectively address problems, but their ability to communicate those approaches to non-behavior analysts. And so I would say, part of that change starts at home, learning to appreciate other designs. So learning about how randomized control trials work and group designs work. That being said, I would argue the same way for the other side, for folks who are between groups folk, to learn the power of single subject design as one method for understanding how the world works is incredibly powerful, and people are missing out on some very important information. But in terms of red flags, when you're reading about group designs, in the popular media or in refereed journals, I would say it isn't so much about the group designs themselves, but again, stepping back and being scientifically minded about what you're reading about. I mean, on both counts, it's important to remember that conclusions in science are drawn from multiple studies using a range of methods from different labs that reach the same general conclusion. But when you read any particular peer-reviewed research, and certainly popular media accounts of research, you have to consider their place in the overall picture. So popular media accounts are motivated not so much by presenting truth or what we know about that phenomenon in a comprehensive way, but what grabs a reader's attention. And that's not a bad thing. It's not a good thing. It's just the way that it is. And so we have to, I think, be wary of the seductiveness of what we read in the newspaper and on news reports. But by the same token, any one research study, that's one research study conducted by a bunch of flawed humans in one research lab. And if it, and that could be absolutely true. It may very well be. But usually when you're reading a headline it's about one study and not maybe the 30 other studies that have done the same thing and found something different.
So if I hear about a study as I'm driving into work on the radio, what I'm hearing from you is that, yes, that should pique my interest and curiosity. And if it's something I am interested in terms of knowing whether or not that study is more rather than less true, that to consider that that's only one data point, if you will, in the in what might be an otherwise larger background of related research.
Absolutely. I mean, and the thing is, when I hear these studies, I hear studies on, if I'm listening to the news or I'm looking at the news online and I see a report of a study, I get excited about it. I get very jazzed about it, or upset, or unhappy, depending on if it's consistent with how I view the world works, how I view things. But you should get excited. You should be interested in it. But what you should never do is view it as truth in any way. It's a picture, one picture of what's going on in the world, but it doesn't represent everything. And you have to take science in its totality, not any one study.
Do you have any other red flags that you're thinking of?
So in terms of what?
In terms of, evaluating research from especially when it's presented by the popular media, someone with, a background who's, not necessarily as well versed in, kind of large randomized controlled trials, et cetera. What are some things to look out for? I'm thinking, and again, my stats are as old as perhaps you remember them. In other words, back in the 90s. So I'm thinking things like small n sizes, or things along those lines.
Well, I think one of the things from the behavior analytic perspective. When it comes to, so maybe I'm going to answer a different question, but I'll come back.
Sure.
But from the behavior analytic perspective, one of the things, when you're reviewing research, is keep in mind, I think most behavior analysts, again, we get trained with more of a single subject design approach, and there's some real power in an idiographic approach and single subject design where you can establish some control. And, and I think that's very good. But and behavioral analysts sometimes get uncomfortable with these large N studies. If you have a treatment group of 50 people, you get uncomfortable. Behavior analysts get uncomfortable with that because they feel like you're losing some of that individual variability within that. But I think it's important to keep in mind there's exquisite and beautiful power in those large N's because it helps control for a variety of other things that are going on that you can't control for at the single subject level. But the issue is to understand some of the strengths of different research designs, and using between group designs has strengths and it certainly has limitations. In terms of, red flags to look out for when you talk about media accounts of things. I mean, there's you could probably teach an entire class on these sorts of things and how the media operates. But it's important to keep in mind that these folks a lot of times are reading an abstract of a journal article. And one of the things I always tell my students is the devil is always in the details. And when I'm writing a journal article and the abstract represents a summation of what the findings are, and it ignores some of the very, very important details that are going on. And you have to be aware of some of the methodological details of any research study to really understand its importance, because it's very easy to gloss over things and not attend to some of the important methodological aspects of the study that can give you either more or less confidence in that particular finding. And the fact is that most media outlets do not report those things. They don't have time to report those things. And so, but being a good
or the expertise.
And so being a good consumer means taking everything with a grain of salt. And that goes for whether it's a media personality reporting something, but it also goes for if it's a bona fide expert reporting something. Everything needs to be taken with a grain of salt, and you have to be able to look at the details.
I see. Very good. I want to kind of transition into a pet topic of yours, pseudoscience.
Sure.
What's your definition of pseudoscience?
That's a really great question. Defining pseudoscience it's funny. It's kind of, defining pseudoscience. It's almost kind of like defining pornography, right? I can't define it, but I know it when I see it. And pseudoscience is the same way. It's not a dichotomous phenomenon where this is pseudoscience over here and this over here is science. The reality is that there are fuzzy boundaries between the polar opposites in an abstract sense of what science and pseudoscience is. Sometimes you can see something that is very, very clear. Okay, this represents science, and then over here at the very end, this is very obviously pseudoscience. But those are the exceptions. The rule is there are things that tend to occur in the middle where it's hard to know whether a phenomenon is science or pseudoscience. There are just these fuzzy boundaries between these two phenomena. And so while it's hard to say what science and pseudoscience is, what I typically advocate for is that people simply look for warning signs that might indicate pseudoscience or some degree of pseudoscience or some degree of more scientific approaches to things. So, just as a handful of examples here, one of the defining features of pseudoscience is the absence of self-correction. So if someone makes a claim that sounds very sciencey, and yet that claim doesn't change as a function of incoming evidence. That's fundamentally what science is. You make a provisional claim about the world, and then that claim changes as more evidence comes in. And so, but one of the defining features of pseudoscience is that you have a claim that tends to stay exactly the same regardless of the evidence that comes in. So
is it more like it transitions into an issue of faith?
And
not to get into any theological discussion or not, but it's like, okay, well, we've run past the evidence.
Yeah, exactly.
But I still feel it in my bones that this is the way it ought to,
Yeah, I don't care what all this evidence says. Like I feel like this is absolutely true, and I think that is could be very very much the case. Um, so it ultimately becomes an issue. I'm going to hold on to this belief. I'm going to hold on to this view of the world in spite of evidence to the contrary. That's pretty classic pseudoscience. And so when you think about things like astrology, claims made by astrologists have pretty much stayed the same over the last couple of thousand years. Um, and in spite of incoming evidence to make it very clear that those claims have no basis in reality, there's been no adjusting to that evidence. The other common warning sign for pseudoscience is the overuse of what we call ad hoc or post hoc hypotheses for things. So you make a claim about something, you make a prediction about something, and then when you test that prediction, it turns out to not be true. And then you say, well, no, I'm right. It's just that there was something going on that interfered with me demonstrating my rightness. Mm-hmm. And you tend to see this in the context of psychics and people making psychic predictions where they're great at making psychic predictions until you start to put some controls in place that make it harder and harder for them to make predictions that are based on very naturalistic explanations for things. But you see this in psychology all the time, where people will make a claim about a particular intervention, make very, very powerful claims about that intervention. But as soon as it gets put to the test under rigorous controls, the claims fall apart. They'll have an explanation that the researchers did something wrong, or there was something different about this sample of people. There's always an explanation for why it didn't work out.
The treatment of autism, has its examples of, I don't know, we can call it pseudoscience, we can call it, strategies that aren't established, I guess using the most, euphemistic description,
sure.
and so forth. And things like oxygen chambers and, mega vitamin diets, and other types of, the biomedical interventions kind of come to mind.
Sure.
And I'm sure there are others as well that I'm, and of course, the granddaddy of them is the vaccine issue and mm-hmm. so forth. You have some thoughts on, kind of what what might be motivating some of these? Can you share those?
Sure. I like to point out before I say that, though, that the examples that you gave are great examples of what I just said, the absence of self-correction. So the vaccine hypothesis in terms of being a cause for autism is a really great example of the absence of self-correction, where you have very profound claims being made about how vaccines affect or cause autism, which is incredibly scary, by the way, and could very well be the case. And if it's true, then you should find evidence for it. But then the problem being that perspective doesn't change as a function of evidence to the contrary. It's a pretty classic indication of pseudoscience. But so ask me your question again. I prefaced my answer for your question with another answer.
You're doing a good job of answering your own question, so yeah. maybe I should just step aside from it. No, this is the Steve Lawyer podcast. I'm kidding. All joking aside, you were saying that you had some thinking about why some of these theories take hold and don't go away despite the absence of evidence.
Oh, absolutely. So one of the things that you tend to see in pseudoscientific approaches and, like, say, alternative medicine is you have, I would say, I try to give people the benefit of the doubt. You have practitioners who genuinely have the best interests of the client or the patient or the individual at heart. I think a lot of times they honestly do have people's best interests at heart. They're not necessarily trying to con them. But what maintains these beliefs in spite of evidence to the contrary? And the bottom line is, hope springs eternal when it comes to the types of problems that people run into where there are not clear indications about how we meaningfully address those problems. So where alternative medicine and pseudoscience really um, fills a gap is in those areas where we don't have bona fide interventions, medical, psychological, behavioral interventions that effectively and meaningfully and quickly address the concerns that people have. So this is pretty classic alternative medicine where you have this alternative medicine that works really, really great, but it doesn't work great for the types of problems that we already have solutions for. It works really, really great for the types of problems where we simply don't have great interventions. And so if you can imagine being a parent of a child who is sick, or if you're someone who is very sick, has a behavioral problem that where we don't have great interventions, it makes sense that someone who comes in with great confidence to sell a product that can help you with your problem, in spite of the fact that there's zero evidence to support that statement, it's very easy to hang on to that because there's nothing really else to grab onto. And so it's a very dangerous area where you have people who are desperate, you have people who are very sick, people who are in pain. It makes them very vulnerable to claims that lack any empirical support whatsoever because they're desperate. They're trying very desperately to get help for the problem that they have. And so it's very hard it's very hard to get people away from that, because when you don't have a great alternative option to give them, it's very very difficult argument to make.
Yeah, and again, relating that back to the, ABA treatment for autism and things like that, it's a situation where there is a viable alternative that does have, a significant amount of evidence behind it. I'm wondering if, that just the extreme challenges and time commitments and all those other things that come along with doing a 25 to 40 hour a week ABA program, and there's that, and then you have on this other, then there's the hyperbaric oxygen chamber, or this other facilitated communication, etc. That I could see how, well, that's that might be a lot easier and less time consuming, and it's not icky like behaviorism is, and I think this prep, and so there might be some not only time commitment issues, but also perhaps some of the bad PR or some of the myths that have been kind of propagated about behavior analysis as well, that might shift people. I'm mainly thinking of parents here into the direction of these kind of less developed alternative remedies, if you will.
Sure, and absolutely. I mean, so let me add a fourth level. So I'm a scientist, psychologist, behavior analyst. After that, I'm a behavioral economist. The work that I do research on delay discounting. And one of the things that's relevant here is people are much more sensitive to outcomes if they're immediate versus delayed. And the fact is, behavior analysis is outstanding for the treatment of autism. But the problem with behavior analysis is that it's a long-term solution. It takes a long time, and it's an enormous amount of work. The response cost associated with applied behavior analysis for autism is pretty profound. But if I come in and say, well, yeah, sure, you can do that if you want, but we're going to go after the real source of the problem, and we're going to do it in a way that leads to a much more immediate positive outcome, you're tapping into just the standard basic human vulnerabilities of being sensitive to those much more immediate outcomes, and that's a very difficult barrier to cross if you're trying to make a sale on a product that has much more empirical support, much more efficacy and effectiveness, but it just takes longer to do. It's harder to do, and it's probably more expensive.
Yeah, the response effort with rigorous ABA interventions high. So we all know that reduces responding in the most basic behavior analytic terms. So, well, you mentioned behavioral economics, and so I think probably what I'll do is leave that as a cliffhanger for Steve Lawyer Part 2. So before we, kind of close the book on science and pseudoscience, are there any other thoughts that you want to leave us with?
Well, I think that the big issue and the struggle that I have, and one of the things for behavior analysts listening to this podcast, that I'd like them to take away is this issue of how do we separate sense from nonsense? How do we separate science from pseudoscience? And, I always try to advocate for open-minded skepticism. And what I mean by that is, this is pretty standard mantras in the skeptical and science community, is you have to be open-minded to claims that may very well be the case. And that open-mindedness is what makes science great. But the other thing that is part of that, you can't just be open-minded and be open to anything that might be. You have to balance that open-mindedness with empirical skepticism, where you might believe that a claim is possible, but the extent to which you believe it should be in measure with how much evidence there is to support that claim. And so I would advocate for people to be absolutely open-minded about things, but a good skeptic is both open-minded and critical and looks for the evidence for that support. And it's easy for us to do when we're looking at what other people to do. It's a lot harder to do when we're looking at ourselves. But that's part of what we have to do as good behavior analysts and good scientists.
Well said. Hey, Steve, thanks a lot. This was great stuff.
Thanks, Matt.
All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, the take-home message today is this. Pseudoscience is like pornography. So if you don't take anything else away from this podcast, remember that. Also remember that, we got the 50-cent tour of Steve's office, and I will put a video clip of that for all of you who want to see what that looks like. I will put a clip of our Skype conversation, the video recording of that on the website. That's at behavioralobservations.com. So, anywho, I want to thank Steve for coming on the show and in all seriousness, talking about a topic that is really relevant to our practice. Thanks a lot, everyone. We'll see you in the next episode.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.